When I heard my husband Derek whisper into his phone at 2 a.m., "The insurance policy is worth $3 million, and with the mountain road conditions this weekend, accidents happen all the time," I knew my marriage was over. What he didn't know was that I, Victoria Chen Morrison, had built a financial empire worth $47 million, and I was about to turn his murderous greed into the most expensive mistake of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Chen Morrison, though for the past 3 years, I had carefully hidden the full extent of what that name represented in the financial world. At 31, I was the founder and CEO of Meridian Asset Management, a boutique investment firm that had quietly grown from a startup in my garage to managing over $2 billion in assets. While my husband Derek believed I worked as a mid-level financial analyst making $80,000 a year, the truth was that my personal net worth had recently crossed the $47 million mark. The deception hadn't started maliciously. When I met Derek Morrison at a charity gala 3 years ago, I was immediately attracted to his charm, his easy laugh, and what seemed like genuine kindness. He was a real estate developer who claimed to build affordable housing projects, and his passion for helping working families find decent homes touched something deep in my heart. At that first meeting, I introduced myself simply as Victoria Chen, a financial professional, without elaborating on the scope of my success. Derek's pursuit was romantic and persistent. He brought me flowers from the farmer's market, took me to small neighborhood restaurants where he seemed to know every server by name, and spoke eloquently about his dream of transforming neglected urban areas into thriving communities. When he proposed 18 months later on the beach where we had shared our first weekend getaway, I said yes, without hesitation. Our wedding was everything I had dreamed of, intimate and elegant, held at the Rosewood Estate overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Derek had insisted on paying for everything himself, claiming it was important for his pride as a man to provide for his bride. I found his old-fashioned values endearing, and didn't push back when he suggested I keep my maiden name professionally while taking his socially. Victoria Chen remained the public face of Meridian Asset Management, while Victoria Morrison was the loving wife who attended neighborhood barbecues and hosted dinner parties in our beautiful craftsman home in Laurel Heights. The house itself was a perfect metaphor for our relationship. Derek had purchased it as a surprise wedding gift, a stunning 1920s home that he claimed to have bought with profits from his latest development project. The 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with its original hardwood floors, craftsman details, and mature garden felt like a fairy tale come to life. I loved every inch of it, from the clawfoot tub in the master bathroom to the built-in bookshelves in the living room where I displayed my growing collection of first-edition business biographies. What I didn't know then was that Derek had financed the house with a combination of risky loans and money borrowed against future development projects that existed more in his imagination than in reality. While I was falling in love with our home and our life together, Derek was constructing an elaborate financial house of cards that would eventually come crashing down around both of us. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 months after our wedding, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Derek began asking casual questions about my work, seemingly innocent inquiries about investment strategies and market trends. Initially, I was delighted by his interest. I had spent years in a male-dominated industry where many men either felt threatened by my success or dismissed my expertise entirely. Having a husband who wanted to understand my work felt like a gift. I began sharing more details about Meridian's investment philosophy, our focus on sustainable growth companies, and our remarkably successful track record. Derek was an attentive listener, asking thoughtful questions and offering what seemed like genuine admiration for my accomplishments. When he suggested that I might consider managing some investments for his real estate projects, I was touched by his confidence in my abilities. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of being completely honest about Meridian's size and my personal wealth, I created a modified version of the truth. I told Derek that I had been promoted to senior analyst with some discretionary investment authority, which explained my knowledge and access to sophisticated financial instruments. I even showed him some of Meridian's marketing materials, carefully omitting the sections that identified me as the founder and majority owner. Derek's enthusiasm was infectious. He began incorporating my investment advice into his business planning, and his projects seemed to benefit from the strategic guidance I provided. Within a year, his small development company had grown significantly, and he was taking on larger, more ambitious projects. I felt proud of our partnership and grateful to be married to a man who valued my professional expertise. Our social life reflected what seemed like genuine happiness. Derek was charming and attentive at dinner parties, always making sure I had everything I needed and introducing me to others with obvious pride. He remembered details about my work projects and would ask thoughtful follow-up questions days or weeks later. When I had particularly stressful periods at Meridian, he would surprise me with my favorite takeout dinner or tickets to the symphony. The second year of our marriage brought new levels of apparent intimacy and partnership. Derek began including me in more of his business decisions, seeking my advice on everything from property acquisitions to financing structures. He even suggested that we might eventually combine our professional efforts into a family business empire, with his real estate expertise complementing my financial acumen. I was so happy during this period that I ignored several warning signs that should have raised immediate red flags. Derek's financial disclosures became increasingly vague when I asked specific questions about his project funding. His explanations for various expenses became more elaborate and less verifiable. Most concerning, he began pushing for us to take out substantial life insurance policies on each other, claiming it was responsible financial planning for a successful young couple. The life insurance conversation should have been my wake-up call, but Derek's presentation was so reasonable and caring that I didn't question his motives. He had done extensive research on different providers and policy structures, ultimately recommending a $3 million policy on each of our lives with the other as beneficiary. His reasoning made perfect sense at the time. We were both young professionals with significant earning potential, and the premiums were easily affordable given our combined income. What made the insurance discussion particularly convincing was Derek's apparent concern for my financial security. He pointed out that while his real estate assets were substantial, they were also illiquid and could be difficult to convert to cash quickly if something happened to him. The insurance money would ensure that I could maintain our lifestyle and continue building my career without financial pressure. Similarly, he argued, my insurance would provide him with the resources to continue his development work while honoring my memory through the affordable housing projects I had grown to care about deeply. Looking back, I realized that Derek's sales pitch for the life insurance was the first time I saw glimpses of the calculating mind that would eventually plot my murder. He had researched not just the policies themselves, but the circumstances under which claims were paid, the investigation processes that
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Insurance companies typically employed, and the statistical likelihood of various types of accidents for people in our demographic. At the time, I interpreted his thoroughness as the mark of a detail-oriented businessman. In reality, he was already beginning to plan my death. The insurance physicals were completed at a medical office Derek had recommended, and both policies were approved within 6 weeks. The first premiums were automatically deducted from our joint checking account, a financial arrangement that Derek had suggested would simplify our household budgeting. I agreed readily, appreciating what seemed like his desire to blend our financial lives more completely. By our second anniversary, Derek had transformed from the charming real estate developer I had fallen in love with into what appeared to be a sophisticated business partner and devoted husband. Our dinner conversations were filled with discussions of investment strategies, development opportunities, and shared dreams for our future. We had begun talking seriously about starting a family, and Derek had even suggested that we might want to purchase a larger home in anticipation of children. The third year of our marriage brought the most happiness I had ever experienced in my adult life, which made the eventual betrayal even more devastating. Derek surprised me with a planned European vacation, a 3-week tour of financial capitals where I could meet with potential international clients while he explored real estate investment opportunities. We spent magical evenings in London, Paris, and Zurich, combining business meetings with romantic dinners and long walks through historic neighborhoods. During our London stay, Derek arranged for us to have dinner with several of his business associates, men who impressed me with their apparent success and sophistication. They spoke knowledgeably about international real estate markets and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about American investment trends. The conversation was stimulating, and I found myself sharing more details about Meridian's investment philosophy and track record than I had ever discussed with Derek's previous business contacts. What I didn't realize at the time was that Derek was using these conversations to gather intelligence about my professional capabilities and financial access. The men we had dinner with weren't his business associates. They were private investigators and financial consultants he had hired to help him understand the true scope of my wealth and professional influence. Every question they asked, every detail they seemed curious about, was part of Derek's systematic effort to determine exactly how much money he could access through our marriage. The European trip also provided Derek with opportunities to begin implementing more sophisticated financial strategies. He convinced me to establish a joint investment account with a Swiss private bank, ostensibly to take advantage of favorable currency exchange rates and European investment opportunities. The account required both our signatures for major transactions, but Derek retained sole access for day-to-day management. I agreed because he claimed to have more experience with international banking, and because I trusted him completely. Our return to San Francisco marked the beginning of what I now understand was the final phase of Derek's long-term plan. He had spent over 2 years gathering information about my financial resources, establishing joint accounts that gave him access to significant funds, and creating insurance policies that would make my death extremely profitable. All that remained was to arrange the circumstances that would allow him to collect on his investment in our marriage. The first indication that Derek's behavior was changing came in the form of subtle pressure about my work schedule and travel plans. He began expressing concern about the risks I was taking by flying frequently for client meetings, claiming that small aircraft accidents were more common than most people realized. When I mentioned planning to attend a conference in Colorado, he spent an entire evening researching mountain driving conditions and automobile accident statistics, ultimately convincing me to choose a conference in Chicago instead. Derek's newfound concern for my safety extended to our weekend activities and social plans. He discouraged me from hiking alone, a practice I had enjoyed for years, citing recent news stories about women who had been attacked on remote trails. When I wanted to try rock climbing with a group of friends, he produced statistics about climbing accidents and convinced me that the risks were unacceptable for someone with my professional responsibilities. At the time, I interpreted Derek's protective instincts as evidence of how much he loved me. I was touched by his concern and grateful to be married to someone who prioritized my well-being over his own convenience. Looking back, I realized that Derek was systematically eliminating activities and situations where my death might appear suspicious, or where he couldn't control the circumstances. The most disturbing change in Derek's behavior was his growing interest in my daily routines and travel plans. He began asking detailed questions about my meeting schedules, wanting to know exactly where I would be at specific times and how long various appointments were expected to last. When I traveled for business, he would call multiple times each day, ostensibly to check on my well-being but actually to monitor my location and activities. Derek also became increasingly interested in our weekend plans, particularly any activities that might take us into remote or potentially dangerous locations. He began suggesting specific destinations for our weekend getaways, always choosing places that involved mountain driving or isolated hiking trails. When I proposed alternative locations that seemed safer or more convenient, he would find reasons why those destinations weren't suitable, ultimately steering us toward the remote locations he had originally suggested. The most chilling aspect of Derek's behavior during this period was his apparent fascination with accident statistics and insurance claim procedures. Our home computer's browser history revealed extensive research into automobile accident rates on various highways, survival statistics for different types of crashes, and the timelines typically required for life insurance companies to process death claims. When I asked Derek about this research, he claimed to be working on a development project near a dangerous mountain highway and needed to understand the risks for potential residents. By the time our third anniversary arrived, Derek had transformed from a loving husband into what I now recognize was a methodical predator. Every conversation, every shared activity, every expression of concern for my welfare was calculated to advance his plan to murder me for insurance money. The man I had fallen in love with had either never existed or had been completely consumed by greed and the fantasy of easy wealth. What Derek didn't know was that his wife was not the moderately successful financial analyst he believed he had married. Victoria Chen Morrison was one of the most successful young investment managers on the West Coast, with personal assets that dwarfed the $3 million insurance policy he was planning to claim. More importantly, I had built my fortune by being exceptionally skilled at reading people, identifying deception, and anticipating betrayal. The night I overheard Derek's phone conversation with his brother would mark the end of his elaborate charade and the beginning of my own carefully planned response. Derek Morrison thought he was married to a naive woman whose death would solve his financial problems. Instead, he had chosen as his victim someone with the resources, intelligence, and moral conviction necessary to destroy his life completely. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Derek's quiet breathing beside me, I began planning my own elaborate deception. Derek wanted to play a game where the stakes were life and death. What he didn't realize was that he had chosen to play against someone who had never lost a game that mattered, and who was about to teach him that predators sometimes become prey when they choose the wrong target. The next morning, Derek woke up next to the same loving wife he had been manipulating for 3 years. But Victoria Chen Morrison was already gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous. Someone who knew exactly what her husband was planning, and who had the resources to ensure that his scheme would destroy him instead of her. The hunt was about to begin, and Derek Morrison had no idea that he had just become the prey. The phone conversation I overheard that night changed everything, but not in the way Derek expected. At exactly 2:17 a.m., I heard him slip out of bed and pad quietly to his home office, closing the door with the careful precision of someone who believed his wife was sound asleep. What Derek didn't know was that I had been awake for hours, my mind racing with suspicions that had been building for weeks. Through the thin walls of our craftsman home, I could hear the muffled sound of Derek's voice, speaking in hushed tones that carried an urgency I had never heard before. Moving silently across the hardwood floors I had once loved, I positioned myself outside his office door, pressing my ear against the cool wood to catch fragments of a conversation that would shatter my world forever. The insurance policy is worth $3 million, and with the mountain road conditions this weekend, accidents happen all the time. Derek's voice carried a coldness that made my blood freeze. She's been wanting to visit that cabin in Mendocino for months. All I have to do is suggest we take the scenic route through the mountains and nature will take care of the rest. The voice on the other end was unmistakably his brother Kevin, whose gravelly laugh I had heard at countless family gatherings. "You sure about this, Derek? I mean, she's your wife. There's gotta be easier ways to get money." Derek's response revealed a depth of calculation that made me physically sick. "Kevin, listen to me. Victoria thinks she's some hotshot financial analyst, but she's just a mid-level employee making decent money. She has no idea about real wealth, real power. $3 million will set us both up for life, and her death will look like a tragic accident on a dangerous mountain road." I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle the gasp that threatened to escape. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a desperate decision. Derek had been planning this methodically, and Kevin was clearly his accomplice in murder. What about the investigation? Kevin's voice carried concern, but not the moral objection I desperately hoped to hear. Insurance companies don't just hand over millions without asking questions. Derek's confidence was chilling. "I've researched this extensively. Single-car accidents on mountain roads are incredibly common, especially during winter conditions. The insurance investigator will see a grieving husband who tried to talk his wife out of taking dangerous routes. I'll have witnesses who heard me expressing concern about her reckless driving habits." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which Derek outlined his plan with the thoroughness of a military operation. He had identified specific curves on Highway 128, where guardrails were minimal and drop-offs were fatal. He had researched weather patterns to choose a weekend when road conditions would be appropriately treacherous. Most disturbingly, he had been documenting what he called my quote, driving behavior for months, creating a paper trail that would support his narrative of a tragic but predictable accident. "The beauty of it," Derek explained to his brother, "is that Victoria trusts me completely. She'll never suspect that I'm leading her to her death. She thinks we're going on a romantic weekend getaway to reconnect and enjoy the beautiful scenery. Instead, she'll be taking her final drive. Kevin's final question revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. What about my cut? You promised me $500,000 for helping with this? Derek's response was immediate and businesslike. As soon as the insurance pays out, you'll get your money. Plus, we'll have eliminated the biggest obstacle to expanding my development business. Victoria's been asking too many questions about my financing lately. With her gone, I can operate without interference. I remained frozen outside Derek's office door for several minutes after the conversation ended, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of his betrayal. The man I had loved and trusted for 3 years wasn't just planning to murder me for money. He was treating my death as a business transaction, complete with profit-sharing arrangements and strategic planning sessions. When I finally crept back to our bedroom, Derek was already sliding under the covers, his breathing quickly settling into the relaxed rhythm of someone without a care in the world. As I lay beside him in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of his peaceful sleep, I realized that my marriage had been built on an elaborate lie, and my husband was a stranger capable of murder. The next morning brought a surreal return to normalcy that felt like stepping into an alternate universe. Derek woke up refreshed and affectionate, bringing me coffee in bed and discussing his plans for the day with the same casual warmth he had shown throughout our marriage. Watching him butter his toast and read the morning news, I searched his face for any sign of the cold-blooded killer I had heard planning my death just hours earlier. I was thinking, Derek said, not looking up from his newspaper, maybe we should plan that trip to Mendocino this weekend. You've been working so hard lately, and the mountain scenery might be exactly what you need to relax. The casual way he delivered this suggestion, knowing it was actually an invitation to my murder, required every ounce of self-control I possessed to respond normally. That sounds wonderful, I managed, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. I'll check my schedule and see if I can clear Friday afternoon. Derek's eyes lit up with what I now recognized was anticipation rather than affection. Perfect. I'll make reservations at that little bed and breakfast you liked in the photos. We can take the scenic route through the mountains, maybe stop at some of those wineries you mentioned wanting to visit. Every word of his suggestion was a carefully crafted element of his murder plan, delivered with the same loving tone he had used to propose marriage. I excused myself to the bathroom, where I spent several minutes staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to understand how I had been so completely deceived by someone I had shared a bed with for 3 years. The face looking back at me belonged to Victoria Chen Morrison, a woman who had built a $47 million financial empire by being smarter, more strategic, and more ruthless than her competitors. That woman would not be led like a lamb to slaughter by a small-time real estate developer who thought $3 million represented meaningful wealth. My first priority was gathering evidence. If Derek believed he could murder me and inherit insurance money based on an elaborate deception, he was about to learn that his wife was far better at deception than he could ever imagine. More importantly, he was about to discover that the woman he planned to kill possessed resources that would allow her to destroy his life completely. I began by installing surveillance equipment throughout our home, tiny cameras and recording devices that would capture Derek's conversations and activities when he believed he was alone. The technology was expensive and sophisticated, the kind of equipment that Victoria Chen Morrison could easily afford, but that Victoria Morrison, the financial analyst, would never have access to. Derek's assumption about my limited resources was about to become his first major miscalculation. The surveillance installation required careful planning to avoid Derek's notice. I used my regular work schedule to purchase equipment and arrange for professional installation, claiming to be upgrading our home security system due to recent break-ins in the neighborhood. Derek seemed pleased by my initiative, praising my practical approach to protecting our home and belongings. Within 48 hours, I had transformed our house into a comprehensive recording studio where every conversation, phone call, and private moment would be documented for future use. Derek's home office, our bedroom, the kitchen, and even his car were now under constant surveillance. If he was going to continue planning my murder, every detail would be captured in high-definition audio and video. The second phase of my response involved investigating Derek's financial situation more thoroughly than I had ever bothered to do during our marriage. Using resources available through Meridian Asset Management, I commissioned a comprehensive background check that would reveal the true state of his business affairs and personal finances. What I discovered was even more disturbing than his murder plot. Derek Morrison's real estate development company was essentially a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that used money from new investors to pay obligations from previous projects. The beautiful home he had given me as a wedding present was financed through a web of interconnected loans that he had no realistic prospect of repaying. His successful businessman persona was as fabricated as his loving husband act. The investigation revealed that Derek owed approximately $12 million to various creditors, with monthly obligations that far exceeded his legitimate income. Several of his recent development projects existed only on paper, elaborate fictional enterprises designed to attract investor money that was immediately diverted to personal expenses and previous debt obligations. Most alarmingly, Derek had been forging financial documents and using my name and credit history to secure loans and lines of credit without my knowledge. The joint accounts we had established during our European trip had been systematically drained to fund his failing business ventures. In addition to planning my murder, Derek had been stealing from me for over a year. The scope of Derek's deception was breathtaking in its complexity and audacity. He had created an entire fictional life story, complete with fake business references, fabricated project histories, and carefully constructed social proof that supported his successful developer image. Even his family relationships were more complicated than I had understood. Kevin wasn't just his brother and accomplice in murder. He was also his business partner in various fraudulent schemes that had been operating for years before I met Derek. Armed with this information, I began developing a response strategy that would address both Derek's immediate threat to my life and his broader pattern of financial crimes. If Derek wanted to play games involving life insurance and staged accidents, I would give him exactly what he was looking for, with a few modifications he wasn't expecting. My plan required establishing credible cover for my own activities, while maintaining the facade of the trusting wife Derek expected to manipulate. I began by taking a leave of absence from Meridian Asset Management, claiming that I needed time to focus on my marriage and consider starting a family. This provided me with the flexibility to implement my strategy without the constraints of my regular work schedule. To Derek, my leave of absence appeared to validate his assessment of me as a woman whose professional ambitions were secondary to domestic priorities. He expressed supportive enthusiasm for my decision, claiming it would allow us to spend more quality time together and plan for our future as a family. What he didn't realize was that my absence from the office would give me unlimited access to resources and expertise that would make his destruction inevitable. The first element of my counter-strategy involved turning Derek's surveillance and documentation efforts against him. If he was creating a paper trail to support his narrative of my reckless driving and dangerous behavior, I would create a more comprehensive record of his criminal activities and murder conspiracy. I hired a team of private investigators to document Derek's movements, financial transactions, and communications with Kevin and other potential accomplices. Unlike Derek's amateur surveillance efforts, my team consisted of former federal agents with sophisticated technical capabilities and legal expertise that would ensure any evidence they gathered would be admissible in court. The investigation quickly revealed that Derek's murder plot was even more elaborate than I had initially understood. He had been researching my daily routines for months, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities that could be exploited to create opportunities for staged accidents. The Mendocino trip was just one of several scenarios he had developed, each designed to result in my death under circumstances that would appear accidental. More disturbing was the discovery that Derek had been practicing elements of his plan. He had made multiple solo trips to the mountain locations where he intended to kill me, timing the drives and identifying the specific locations where a car accident would be most likely to prove fatal. His level of preparation suggested that he had been planning my murder almost from the beginning of our relationship. The surveillance also revealed the extent of Derek's financial desperation. His business was collapsing more rapidly than even my background investigation had indicated. He was fielding multiple calls each day from creditors demanding payment, and several of his largest investors were threatening legal action. The $3 million insurance payout wasn't just a get-rich-quick scheme. It was Derek's only realistic hope of avoiding bankruptcy and potential criminal prosecution. Kevin's role in the conspiracy extended far beyond simple accomplice. He was actively helping Derek develop and refine the murder plan, contributing suggestions about timing, location, and methods that would minimize the risk of detection. Their conversations revealed a casual attitude toward violence that suggested this wasn't their first collaboration in serious criminal activity. Most importantly, the surveillance captured detailed discussions of Derek's intended timeline. He was planning to execute his plan during our upcoming Mendocino trip, which was now just 10 days away. The urgency of his financial situation meant that he couldn't afford to wait for a better opportunity. This weekend would be his attempt to murder me for insurance money. Armed with this knowledge, I began implementing the final phase of my strategy. Derek Morrison believed he was married to a naive financial analyst who could be easily manipulated and murdered. Instead, he was about to discover that his wife was a sophisticated predator who had been analyzing his weaknesses and preparing his destruction while he plotted her death. The irony was perfect. Derek had spent months researching insurance claim procedures and accident investigation protocols, never realizing that his wife possessed far more knowledge about financial systems and legal processes than he could imagine. While he was planning a $3 million insurance fraud, I was preparing to systematically dismantle his entire life through methods he lacked the sophistication to understand or anticipate. My counterattack would begin with Derek's most vulnerable point: his precarious financial situation. If he wanted to commit murder for money, I would ensure that his financial problems became exponentially worse, eliminating any possible benefit from my death, while simultaneously exposing his criminal activities to law enforcement and his victims. The beauty of my plan was that Derek would never see it coming. He was so focused on his amateur murder scheme that he remained completely oblivious to the professional-level destruction being prepared by someone with resources and capabilities far beyond his comprehension. Derek Morrison thought he was the predator in our relationship, but he was about to learn that he had married someone who could destroy him without breaking a sweat. The psychological challenge of maintaining normal interactions with Derek while knowing he was planning to murder me required drawing on reserves of self-control I didn't know I possessed. Every morning conversation over coffee, every casual discussion about weekend plans, every moment of physical intimacy became an exercise in performance art, where the stakes were literally life and death. Derek's behavior during this period revealed subtle changes that I might have missed if I hadn't known what to look for. He became more attentive to my moods and reactions, studying my responses to his suggestions with the intensity of someone conducting psychological research. When he mentioned specific routes or activities for our upcoming trip, he watched my face carefully, clearly trying to gauge whether I suspected anything unusual about his plans. His affection during this period took on a quality that I now recognized as guilt-driven overcompensation. He brought me flowers more frequently, suggested romantic dinners at expensive restaurants, and initiated physical intimacy with an intensity that felt desperate rather than loving. Looking back, I realized Derek was unconsciously trying to convince himself that he could murder someone he genuinely cared about, and his increased attention was his way of reconciling his emotions with his criminal intentions. The most disturbing aspect of Derek's behavior was his apparent excitement about our upcoming trip. He researched restaurants and activities in Mendocino with unusual enthusiasm, creating detailed itineraries that emphasized scenic mountain drives and isolated hiking trails. His excitement wasn't about spending time with his wife. It was about the approaching culmination of months of planning and preparation. Meanwhile, my own preparations were proceeding with the systematic efficiency that had made Meridian Asset Management one of the most successful investment firms on the West Coast. Derek might be planning an amateur murder scheme, but I was orchestrating a professional-level destruction that would eliminate every aspect of his life, while ensuring that justice was served for his intended victims. The financial component of my strategy was already showing results. Using shell companies and strategic partnerships, I had begun systematically calling in Derek's debts and eliminating his access to credit. The process was subtle enough that Derek hadn't yet realized the scope of what was happening, but his financial foundation was crumbling beneath his feet, while he remained focused on planning my death. His investors were becoming increasingly demanding, as I anonymously provided them with information about Derek's fraudulent practices and misappropriation of funds. Several had already initiated legal proceedings to recover their money, and others were cooperating with law enforcement investigations that would soon expose the full scope of Derek's criminal activities. The timeline was perfect. Derek's murder plot was scheduled for this weekend, but his financial collapse would begin Monday morning, when multiple lawsuits would be filed simultaneously in different jurisdictions. By the time Derek realized what was happening, his access to money, credit, and legal resources would be completely eliminated. Most satisfying was the knowledge that Derek's own greed and impatience had made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of systematic destruction I was implementing. If he had been content with the life we had built together, he could have eventually shared in genuine wealth that far exceeded his wildest dreams. Instead, his decision to murder me for a relatively modest insurance payout would result in losing everything while facing life in prison. The surveillance equipment I had installed was providing a detailed record of Derek's final preparations for my murder. His conversations with Kevin revealed increasing nervousness about the plan, but also determination to proceed despite their obvious amateur status. They had convinced themselves that careful planning could substitute for experience, never realizing that their scheme contained fundamental flaws that would ensure their eventual capture and prosecution. Derek's research into accident investigation procedures was particularly revealing of his naive understanding of how law enforcement actually operated. He had focused on the immediate investigation that would follow my death, never considering the more sophisticated financial analysis that would inevitably follow when insurance companies began examining a $3 million claim. His knowledge of investigative procedures was entirely theoretical, based on internet research rather than practical understanding of how these systems actually functioned. The contrast between Derek's amateur preparation and my professional-level response was stark and decisive. While he was worrying about tire tracks and witness statements, I was implementing a comprehensive strategy that addressed legal, financial, and evidentiary considerations with the thoroughness of someone who had built a career on outmaneuvering sophisticated opponents. As our departure date approached, Derek's behavior became increasingly artificial and strained. His attempts at normal conversation felt rehearsed, and his expressions of affection carried an undercurrent of desperation that would have been obvious even without my knowledge of his true intentions. He was clearly struggling with the psychological reality of murdering someone he had lived with intimately for 3 years. Kevin's presence in our home became more frequent as the weekend approached, ostensibly for casual social visits but actually for final planning sessions that my surveillance equipment captured in complete detail. Their conversations revealed that they had identified multiple backup scenarios in case their primary plan encountered unexpected complications, demonstrating a level of criminal sophistication that was nevertheless far below what would be required to avoid eventual detection and prosecution. The most chilling moment came when Derek practiced his emotional response to my death, rehearsing the grief-stricken husband act he would perform for investigators and insurance representatives. Watching him simulate tears and practice expressions of shock and loss while knowing he was planning to cause that exact scenario was profoundly disturbing and strengthened my resolve to ensure that his scheme would destroy him completely. Friday morning arrived with Derek exhibiting nervous energy that he tried to mask as excitement about our romantic getaway. His final preparations were elaborate and revealing, including careful attention to our route, specific timing for various stops, and detailed plans for activities that would position us at the murder location during optimal conditions. What Derek didn't know was that his wife would not be the naive victim he expected to manipulate and murder. Instead, Victoria Chen Morrison was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when a sophisticated predator chose the wrong target. The weekend Derek had planned as my final days alive would instead mark the beginning of his complete destruction, implemented by someone with resources and capabilities far beyond his ability to understand or counter. The drive to Mendocino would proceed exactly as Derek had planned, with one crucial modification. Instead of ending with my death and Derek's financial salvation, this weekend would conclude with his arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and the systematic dismantling of every aspect of his life. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Derek Morrison had no idea that his wife had already won a game he didn't even know they were playing. Friday afternoon arrived with an unseasonably warm October sun streaming through our bedroom windows as Derek loaded our weekend bags into his silver BMW sedan. His movements were precise and deliberate, each action carefully calculated to support what he believed would be the final chapter of our marriage. What Derek didn't realize was that his wife had spent the week implementing a strategy that would turn his murder plot into the most expensive mistake of his life. I watched from the kitchen window as Derek performed his final vehicle inspection, checking tire pressure and fluid levels, with the thoroughness of someone preparing for a journey far more significant than a romantic weekend getaway. His behavior carried an intensity that would have seemed like excessive caution to an innocent observer, but I now recognized as the methodical preparation of a man planning to commit murder. The drive to Mendocino began exactly as Derek had planned, with gentle conversation about work stress and the need for quality time together. His performance was masterful, combining genuine affection with subtle manipulation designed to put me at ease about the dangerous mountain routes he intended to use for my murder. As we merged onto Highway 101, Derek's hand found mine across the center console, his touch warm and familiar despite the knowledge that these same hands would soon attempt to end my life. Derek's route selection revealed the extent of his preparation and research. Instead of taking the direct coastal highway that most travelers preferred, he chose an inland path that would take us through the treacherous mountain curves of Highway 128. His explanation was perfectly reasonable, emphasizing scenic beauty and charming small towns that would make our journey more memorable and romantic. During the first hour of driving, Derek maintained casual conversation about his recent projects and my work at what he believed was my mid-level analyst position. His questions carried a subtle probing quality, as if he were gathering final intelligence about my professional situation and financial resources. What Derek didn't realize was that every question revealed more about his own misconceptions and provided additional evidence of his criminal intent. My responses were carefully calibrated to reinforce Derek's assumptions about my limited financial resources and naive trust in his guidance. I expressed gratitude for his business acumen and admiration for his success in real estate development, never revealing that I had spent the week systematically destroying the financial foundation of his fraudulent empire. As we entered the mountainous terrain of Mendocino County, Derek's behavior began to shift in ways that would have been imperceptible to someone who didn't know what to expect. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, his breathing became more controlled, and his conversation took on a slightly forced quality that suggested increasing nervousness about what he was planning to do. The scenic overlooks that Derek pointed out during our drive were actually reconnaissance points he had identified during his previous solo trips to plan my murder. Each stop provided him with opportunities to assess road conditions, traffic patterns, and the specific geographic features that would make a fatal accident appear convincingly accidental. During one particularly elaborate stop at a mountain vista, Derek produced his phone and began taking photographs of me against the dramatic backdrop of rolling hills and deep valleys. His camera work was unusually thorough, capturing multiple angles and poses that would later serve as poignant final images of his beloved wife enjoying her last weekend alive. The irony of Derek creating evidence of my happiness just hours before planning to murder me was both chilling and revealing of his complete lack of genuine emotional connection to my well-being. Our arrival at the Mendocino bed and breakfast occurred just as Derek had planned, with enough daylight remaining for an evening walk through the charming coastal village. The inn itself was exactly the kind of romantic destination that would support Derek's narrative of a loving husband trying to create special memories with his wife before her tragic accidental death. The proprietors, an elderly couple named Margaret and James, greeted us with the warm hospitality that had made their establishment a favorite among couples seeking romantic getaways. Their genuine pleasure in welcoming us created a stark contrast to the dark purpose that had brought Derek to their beautiful property. Our room was everything Derek had promised when he made the reservation, with a stone fireplace, antique furnishings, and a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The setting was undeniably romantic, which made Derek's true intentions even more disturbing. He had chosen this location not to create happy memories, but to provide the perfect backdrop for his performance as a grieving widower. Derek's behavior during our first evening at the inn revealed the psychological strain of maintaining his deception while preparing for murder. His affection felt desperate and overcompensated, as if he were trying to convince himself that he could love someone he was planning to kill. Our dinner conversation was stilted, despite his obvious efforts to create an atmosphere of intimacy and connection. The restaurant Derek had chosen for dinner was another carefully calculated element of his plan. The establishment was popular enough that other guests would remember seeing us together, providing witnesses to our apparent happiness and his devoted attention to my comfort and enjoyment. Every gesture of affection, every solicitous inquiry about my meal preferences, was performed for an audience that would later testify to Derek's love for his wife. During dinner, Derek raised his wineglass in a toast that now seems particularly grotesque in retrospect. "To my beautiful wife," he said, his eyes meeting mine with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Thank you for 3 wonderful years of marriage. And here's to many more adventures together." The toast was delivered with perfect sincerity, despite Derek's knowledge that he was planning to ensure there would be no future adventures together. After dinner, we walked hand in hand through the quaint streets of Mendocino, stopping to window shop at galleries and boutiques that catered to tourists seeking authentic coastal charm. Derek's attention to creating romantic memories was meticulous and disturbing, as if he were directing a movie about the perfect marriage rather than living genuine moments with someone he claimed to love. Saturday morning brought the beautiful autumn weather that Derek had hoped for, with clear skies and crisp temperatures that would make mountain driving particularly appealing. His enthusiasm for an early start was obvious, though he disguised his eagerness as excitement about showing me scenic locations he had discovered during his business travels in the region. Derek's route planning for our Saturday drive revealed the full scope of his preparation and criminal intent. He had identified specific curves and overlooks where a car accident would be most likely to prove fatal, timing our departure to ensure we would reach these locations during optimal conditions for his murder scheme. The first stop on Derek's carefully planned itinerary was a winery that provided legitimate tourist cover for our presence in the area. His performance as an enthusiastic wine enthusiast was convincing, and his knowledge of local vintages suggested he had invested considerable research in creating credible reasons for our visit to this remote region. During the wine tasting, Derek engaged in casual conversation with other visitors, establishing our presence and his identity as a loving husband treating his wife to a special weekend getaway. These interactions created additional witnesses who would later remember Derek as a devoted spouse, supporting his eventual claim that my death was a tragic accident rather than a carefully planned murder. As we left the winery and continued into the more remote mountain areas, Derek's behavior became increasingly focused and determined. His conversation shifted from casual tourism topics to more specific discussions about road conditions and driving safety, ostensibly expressing concern for my well-being while actually preparing the narrative that would support his insurance claim. The location Derek had chosen for my murder was a particularly treacherous section of Highway 128, where the road curved sharply around the edge of a steep canyon. His research had identified this spot as offering optimal conditions for a fatal single-car accident, with minimal guardrail protection and a drop-off that would ensure survival was impossible. Derek's plan required him to create a situation where he could cause our car to leave the roadway while ensuring his own survival and maintaining plausible deniability about the circumstances that led to the crash. His scheme involved claiming that I had insisted on driving despite his concerns about my inexperience with mountain roads, allowing him to position himself as a reluctant passenger who survived a crash caused by my reckless driving. What Derek didn't know was that his wife had spent the week preparing a counter-strategy that would expose his murder plot while simultaneously destroying every aspect of his life. The surveillance equipment I had installed was providing real-time documentation of his criminal activities, and the financial investigation I had commissioned was revealing the full scope of his fraudulent business practices. More importantly, Derek's assumption that he was married to a naive financial analyst with limited resources was about to be shattered in the most dramatic way possible. Victoria Chen Morrison possessed capabilities and resources that Derek couldn't begin to comprehend, and his murder plot was about to trigger a response that would destroy him completely. As we approached the location Derek had chosen for my death, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of both our lives forever. Instead of allowing Derek to implement his amateur murder scheme, I I was going to reveal exactly who he had chosen as his victim and demonstrate the consequences of targeting someone with my level of sophistication and resources. Derek's first indication that something was wrong came when I calmly asked him to pull over at a scenic overlook just before the curve where he planned to stage the accident. My request seemed reasonable, fitting perfectly with the tourist activities we had been enjoying throughout the weekend. But Derek's reaction revealed his nervousness about any deviation from his carefully planned timeline. The overlook I had chosen provided a dramatic view of the surrounding mountains and valleys, but more importantly, it offered complete privacy for the conversation that would end Derek's deception forever. As we stepped out of the car and walked toward the viewing area, Derek's body language revealed increasing anxiety about the delay in his murder schedule. "Derek Morrison," I said, turning to face him with a calm directness that immediately captured his complete attention. "We need to discuss your plan to murder me for insurance money, and what's going to happen to you instead." The color drained from Derek's face so completely that I thought he might collapse. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as his mind struggled to process what I had just said. The confident, calculating killer who had been planning my death for months was suddenly faced with the realization that his intended victim knew exactly what he was planning. "You heard the phone conversation," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. His admission confirmed what I already knew, but hearing him acknowledge his criminal intent was still shocking in its casual matter-of-factness. "I heard everything, Derek. Your plan to stage an accident on these mountain roads. Kevin's agreement to help you murder me for $500,000. Your research into insurance claim procedures and accident investigation protocols. Your practice runs to identify the perfect location for my death. All of it." Derek's face cycled through a series of expressions that revealed the complete collapse of his carefully constructed facade. Denial, fear, desperation, and finally a calculating coldness that showed me the real person I had been married to for 3 years. "Victoria," Derek said, his voice taking on the manipulative tone I now recognized as his default mode when facing challenges. "You're misunderstanding what you heard. Kevin and I were discussing a screenplay we're working on together. It's a thriller about insurance fraud, and we were just brainstorming plot points." His attempted deception was so pathetic that I almost felt sorry for him. The man who had spent months planning an elaborate murder scheme was reduced to claiming his criminal conspiracy was actually a creative writing project. "Derek," I replied, my voice carrying the authority that came naturally when addressing someone who had underestimated me so completely. "I have recordings of every conversation you've had about this plan. I have evidence of your financial crimes and fraudulent business practices. I have documentation of your reconnaissance trips to this exact location. Your screenplay defense isn't going to help you." Derek's demeanor changed immediately as he realized the full scope of what was happening. The mask of the loving husband fell away completely, revealing the cold, calculating predator who had been manipulating me for 3 years. "You think you're so smart," Derek snarled, his voice carrying a viciousness I had never heard before. "You're just a mid-level financial analyst who got lucky and overheard something you didn't understand. You have no idea what you're dealing with." His transformation was complete and revealing. The charming, sophisticated businessman I had fallen in love with had been a complete fabrication. The real Derek Morrison was a desperate criminal who had married me specifically to steal my money and eventually murder me for insurance benefits. "Actually, Derek," I said, pulling out my phone to display Meridian Asset Management's website with my photograph prominently featured as founder and CEO. "I'm Victoria Chen Morrison, and I think it's time you learned exactly who you tried to murder." Derek stared at the screen with growing confusion and horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The woman he had planned to kill for $3 million in insurance money was actually worth $47 million and controlled assets that dwarfed his entire fictional business empire. "That's impossible," Derek whispered, his voice carrying the shock of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing. "You work as an analyst. You drive a Honda Civic. You live in a house I bought for you." "Derek," I replied, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had built a financial empire by being smarter and more strategic than her competition. "I am Meridian Asset Management, The Honda Civic is one of 7 cars I own. And the house you think you bought for me is actually owned by one of my shell companies. You've been living in my property for 3 years while planning to murder me for pocket change." The revelation hit Derek like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly as he grasped the armrest of a nearby bench for support. The confident killer who had been planning my death was suddenly faced with the reality that he had chosen as his victim someone with resources and capabilities far beyond his ability to understand or counter. "More importantly, Derek," I continued, "while you've been focused on your amateur murder scheme, I've been systematically destroying your life. Your investors have been notified about your fraudulent business practices. Your creditors are demanding immediate payment of all outstanding obligations. Your brother Kevin has been arrested on conspiracy charges, based on the recordings I provided to law enforcement." Derek's face went white as he realized that his financial collapse wasn't a series of unfortunate coincidences. His wife had been orchestrating his destruction with the same methodical precision he had used to plan her murder. "As of Monday morning," I said, "consulting my phone for messages from my legal team, Thornfield Development will be in bankruptcy proceedings. Your personal assets will be frozen pending investigation of criminal activities. And you will be arrested for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and multiple counts of financial crimes." Derek stared at me with growing understanding of how completely he had been outmaneuvered. The woman he had planned to murder was not only far wealthier than he had imagined, but also far more sophisticated in her approach to solving problems that threatened her well-being. "The beauty of my strategy, Derek, is that your own greed and criminal behavior provided all the evidence necessary to destroy you. While you were researching accident locations and insurance claim procedures, I was documenting your fraudulent business practices and criminal conspiracy. You created the perfect conditions for your own destruction." Derek's reaction revealed the psychological reality of facing consequences he had never considered possible. His entire identity had been built around being smarter and more sophisticated than the people he manipulated and exploited. Discovering that his wife had been playing a game several levels above his understanding was devastating to his sense of self. "What do you want?" Derek asked, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who realized he had no leverage or options remaining. His transformation from confident predator to defeated criminal was complete and irreversible. "Justice, Derek. I want you to understand that actions have consequences. That marriage isn't a business transaction where you can murder your spouse for profit. That respect and trust are earned through character, not stolen through deception." I turned to face him directly, my voice carrying the finality of someone who had made decisions that would reshape both our lives forever. "You chose to see me as a victim, whose death would solve your financial problems. Instead, you've discovered that your wife is someone who built a fortune by being better at strategy and execution than people like you could ever imagine." Derek's face showed the complete collapse of everything he had believed about himself and his situation. The man who had planned to profit from my death was now facing the loss of everything he cared about, implemented by the woman he had intended to murder. "The irony is perfect, Derek. You researched insurance claim procedures and accident investigation protocols, never realizing that your wife understands financial systems and legal processes better than you ever could. While you were planning a $3 million insurance fraud, I was preparing to systematically dismantle your entire life through methods you lack the sophistication to understand." Derek remained silent, his mind apparently struggling to process the magnitude of his miscalculation and the inevitability of his destruction. The confident killer who had driven me to this location, planning to commit murder, was now faced with the reality that he had been comprehensively defeated by someone whose capabilities he had never bothered to understand. "Your murder plot ends here, Derek, but your legal problems are just beginning. The evidence I've gathered will ensure that you spend the next 20 years in prison, thinking about what happened when you chose the wrong target for your criminal ambitions." As I spoke these words, the sound of approaching vehicles indicated that law enforcement was arriving exactly on schedule. The timing was perfect, allowing Derek to understand the full scope of his situation before being arrested for the crimes he had committed and planned to commit. The FBI agents and local police officers who emerged from the unmarked vehicles moved with the professional efficiency of people executing a carefully planned operation. Derek's arrest was swift and thorough, with agents reading his rights while others secured evidence from our vehicle and the surrounding area. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, the lead investigator, approached me with the respectful deference appropriate for someone whose cooperation had made their case possible. Ms. Chen Morrison, thank you for your assistance in this investigation. The evidence you provided has been invaluable in building our case against Mr. Morrison and his associates. The arrest proceeded exactly as I had planned, with Derek being taken into custody on charges that would ensure he never had another opportunity to harm innocent people for financial gain. His conspiracy to commit murder, combined with his extensive financial crimes, would result in a prison sentence that would effectively end his life as a free man. As Derek was placed in the back of the police vehicle, his eyes met mine one final time. The look he gave me was a mixture of hatred, respect, and complete defeat. The man who had planned to murder me for insurance money now understood that he had chosen as his victim someone capable of destroying his entire existence without breaking a sweat. The investigation that followed Derek's arrest revealed the full scope of his criminal activities and the sophistication of the response I had implemented. Law enforcement officials were impressed by the quality of evidence I had gathered and the strategic thinking that had made their case virtually airtight. Derek's financial crimes extended far beyond what even my investigation had initially revealed. His fraudulent business practices had victimized dozens of investors and contractors, creating a trail of financial destruction that would take years to fully address. The conspiracy to murder me was actually just the culmination of a criminal career that had been escalating for years. Kevin Morrison's arrest provided additional evidence of the brothers' criminal partnership and their casual attitude toward violence as a solution to financial problems. His cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence revealed details about Derek's plans that made the premeditation even more obvious and disturbing. The media coverage of Derek's arrest focused on the dramatic reversal of fortune that had led a would-be murderer to target someone with the resources and intelligence necessary to destroy him completely. Financial journalists were particularly interested in the story of how Victoria Chen Morrison had used her business skills to implement justice when the legal system couldn't protect her from her husband's criminal intentions. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of legal preparation and presentation. The prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen, used the evidence I had gathered to build a case that left no doubt about Derek's guilt or the premeditated nature of his crimes. Derek's defense team attempted to portray him as a desperate businessman whose marriage had driven him to consider extreme measures, but the evidence of his systematic planning and criminal conspiracy made this narrative impossible to sustain. The recordings of his conversations with Kevin provided undeniable proof of his intent to commit murder for financial gain. The most powerful moment of the trial came when I testified about discovering Derek's plan and implementing my response. My description of the methodical way Derek had researched and planned my murder, combined with the evidence of his fraudulent business practices, created a compelling picture of a predator who had chosen the wrong victim. Derek's conviction on all charges was unanimous and swift. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, securities fraud, and multiple counts of theft and embezzlement. His sentence of 35 years without possibility of parole ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people for financial gain. The aftermath of Derek's conviction brought a sense of justice and closure that extended far beyond my personal situation. His victims in the real estate fraud schemes received compensation through asset forfeiture proceedings, and the publicity surrounding his case led to increased scrutiny of similar fraudulent business practices throughout the industry. Most importantly, Derek's case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that wealth and sophistication could substitute for genuine character and moral integrity. His complete defeat by someone he had underestimated served as a powerful reminder that predators sometimes become prey when they choose targets with superior resources and capabilities. The financial empire I had built continued to grow and prosper in the years following Derek's conviction. Meridian Asset Management expanded into new markets and investment areas, always maintaining the ethical standards and client focus that had made our success possible. The experience with Derek had reinforced my commitment to using wealth and power responsibly, ensuring that my resources served to protect and advance legitimate interests rather than exploit vulnerable people. The house that Derek had believed he purchased for me became a symbol of how completely he had misunderstood our relationship and my resources. I eventually donated the property to a nonprofit organization that provided transitional housing for women escaping domestic violence, creating something positive from what had been intended as the setting for an elaborate deception. The insurance policies that Derek had viewed as the source of easy money were canceled immediately following his arrest, with the insurance company expressing gratitude for my cooperation in exposing the fraudulent claims that would have cost them millions of dollars. The premiums we had paid were refunded with interest, providing additional evidence of how thoroughly Derek's scheme had been defeated. Perhaps most satisfying was the knowledge that Derek's own character flaws and criminal tendencies had made his destruction inevitable. If he had been content with the genuine partnership our marriage could have provided, he might eventually have shared in wealth that far exceeded his wildest dreams of insurance fraud. Instead, his decision to see me as a victim rather than a partner ensured that he lost everything while facing decades in prison. The story of Derek Morrison's failed murder plot became a case study in business schools and law enforcement training programs, illustrating how sophisticated criminals could be defeated by targets with superior resources and strategic thinking. The methodical way I had documented his crimes and implemented his destruction served as a model for how victims could take control of situations where traditional legal protections were insufficient. Years later, as I stood in my penthouse office overlooking the San Francisco Bay, I reflected on the lessons learned from my marriage to Derek Morrison. The experience had taught me that trust must be earned through consistent actions, rather than accepted based on surface appearances. More importantly, it had demonstrated that true strength came not from the ability to exploit others, but from the wisdom to use power and resources in ways that created justice and protected the innocent. Derek Morrison had believed he could murder his wife for insurance money and live happily ever after with his ill-gotten gains. Instead, he discovered that his intended victim was someone who understood power, strategy, and justice better than he could ever imagine. The predator had become prey, and the hunter had learned that choosing the wrong target could result in complete destruction. Sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't forgiveness or moving on. Sometimes justice requires using every resource and capability at your disposal to ensure that predators face consequences for their actions. Derek Morrison had planned to profit from my death, but instead he learned that targeting Victoria Chen Morrison was the most expensive mistake he could possibly make. The months following Derek's conviction brought unexpected challenges that tested my resolve and forced me to confront the deeper implications of what I had experienced. While the legal system had delivered justice and Derek would spend decades in prison for his crimes, the psychological aftermath of discovering that my husband had planned to murder me required a different kind of healing and resolution. The first challenge came in the form of media attention that I had not anticipated when I decided to expose Derek's criminal activities. The story of a billionaire CEO who had gone undercover as a middle-class wife to catch her murderous husband captured public imagination in ways that made my normally private life suddenly very public. Financial journalists who had respected my preference for operating behind the scenes were now eager to explore every detail of how I had built Meridian Asset Management while maintaining such complete anonymity. The attention was both flattering and invasive, forcing me to make decisions about how much of my personal story I was willing to share with the world. The version of events that emerged in the media focused heavily on the dramatic confrontation and Derek's arrest, but necessarily omitted many of the more complex emotional and psychological elements that had made the experience so profoundly disturbing. What the public didn't understand was the extent to which Derek's betrayal had forced me to question not just my judgment about him, but my approach to relationships and trust more generally. The man I had shared a bed with for 3 years had been systematically planning my murder while performing the role of loving husband with convincing authenticity. The implications of that level of deception extended far beyond the specific crimes Derek had committed. I found myself struggling with questions that had no easy answers. How could someone maintain such an elaborate facade for so long without revealing their true nature? What did Derek's success at manipulating me say about my ability to read people and make sound judgments about character? Most troubling, how many other people in my life might be capable of similar deception if the right incentives were present? The psychological evaluation that Derek underwent as part of his legal proceedings provided some disturbing insights into the mindset that had made his crimes possible. According to the forensic psychiatrist who examined him, Derek exhibited classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, including a complete lack of empathy for his victims, and an ability to compartmentalize his emotions that allowed him to maintain loving relationships while simultaneously planning violence. The psychiatrist's report explained that Derek's criminal behavior wasn't the result of temporary desperation or a momentary lapse in judgment. His capacity for deception and manipulation had been developed over many years, with our marriage representing just the most recent and elaborate of his criminal enterprises. The man I had fallen in love with had been a carefully constructed persona, designed specifically to exploit my wealth and trust. This revelation was both validating and deeply unsettling. While it confirmed that Derek's deception had been sophisticated enough to fool someone with my experience and intelligence, it also raised disturbing questions about how many other Derek Morrisons might be operating in the world of wealth and privilege where I conducted my business and social life. The investigation into Derek's background revealed a pattern of relationships with wealthy women that followed remarkably similar patterns to our marriage. In each case, Derek had presented himself as a successful businessman with romantic ideals and traditional values, gradually gaining access to his target's financial resources before the relationship ended, under circumstances that left him financially better off than when it began. I had been Derek's most ambitious target, representing the largest potential payout he had ever attempted to secure. But I was not his first victim, just the first one with sufficient resources and sophistication to expose his criminal activities and ensure that he faced meaningful consequences for his actions. The other women Derek had victimized began coming forward after his arrest, sharing stories that revealed the scope of his criminal career and the devastating impact his deceptions had on their lives. Sarah Mitchell, a successful attorney in Los Angeles, had lost over $200,000 to Derek's fraudulent investment schemes before discovering that his entire business operation was fictitious. Jennifer Park, a surgeon in Portland, had provided Derek with access to medical equipment financing that he had used to fund personal expenses rather than the legitimate medical device company he claimed to be developing. Her professional reputation had been damaged by association with Derek's fraudulent activities, and she had spent years rebuilding the trust and credibility that his deception had cost her. Most heartbreaking was the story of Rebecca Thompson, a widow whose husband had left her a substantial life insurance settlement that Derek had systematically stolen through a series of increasingly elaborate investment fraud schemes. Rebecca had lost not only her financial security, but also her faith in her ability to make sound decisions about money and relationships. These women's stories provided important context for understanding Derek's methods and motivations, but they also created a sense of responsibility that weighed heavily on my conscience. If I had been more careful in investigating Derek's background before marrying him, if I had been less trusting of his romantic presentations and business claims, other women might have been spared the suffering that Derek's criminal activities had caused. The victim support group that formed in the aftermath of Derek's conviction became an unexpected source of healing and perspective for all of us who had been touched by his crimes. Meeting regularly to share our experiences and support each other through the legal proceedings and emotional recovery, we developed bonds that transcended the circumstances that had brought us together. Through these conversations, I began to understand that Derek's success at deception wasn't a reflection of his victim's naivete or poor judgment. His criminal sophistication had been developed over years of practice, and his ability to research and exploit his target's vulnerabilities represented a level of predatory skill that most honest people would find difficult to anticipate or defend against. Rebecca Thompson's insights were particularly valuable in helping me process the psychological aftermath of Derek's betrayal. As someone who had been married to her late husband for 23 years before his death, she had extensive experience with genuine love and partnership that provided a helpful contrast to Derek's carefully manufactured affection. The difference between real love and Derek's performance, Rebecca explained during one of our group sessions, wasn't something you could identify through any single moment or conversation. It was only visible when you looked at patterns over time and understood how a genuinely loving person responded to stress, conflict, and opportunities for personal gain at their partner's expense. Derek's love had always been conditional and strategic, designed to advance his criminal objectives rather than support my well-being and happiness. A genuinely loving husband would have been proud of my professional success and eager to support my career advancement. Derek had been threatened by my competence and motivated to steal from and eventually murder me. The financial investigation that had led to Derek's conviction also revealed information about his family background that provided additional context for understanding how he had developed such sophisticated criminal capabilities. Derek's father had been convicted of securities fraud when Derek was in college, and his brother Kevin had a history of involvement in various financial crimes that predated their conspiracy to murder me. What emerged was a picture of a family culture that normalized deception and rationalized criminal behavior as acceptable responses to financial pressure or opportunity. Derek hadn't become a criminal because of desperation or temporary circumstances. He had been raised in an environment where fraud and manipulation were viewed as legitimate business strategies. This family background also explained Kevin's casual willingness to participate in planning my murder. For both brothers, violence was simply another tool that could be used to solve financial problems, no different from forgery, embezzlement, or any other criminal activity they had engaged in throughout their adult lives. The realization that Derek's criminal behavior was part of a multi-generational family tradition was both enlightening and disturbing. It suggested that his crimes weren't aberrations that could be explained by individual psychology or temporary circumstances, but rather the predictable result of cultural values that prioritized financial gain over human welfare and ethical behavior. Understanding Derek's background helped me process my own experience and move toward genuine healing and recovery. The man I had married hadn't hidden a different but fundamentally decent person beneath his criminal activities. Derek Morrison was exactly who he appeared to be when he was planning my murder, discussing insurance fraud with his brother, and stealing money from my accounts. The loving husband persona had been the disguise, not the criminal who had been revealed when the stakes became high enough. The expansion of Meridian Asset Management in the years following Derek's conviction reflected both my determination to build something positive from the experience and my commitment to using the lessons I had learned to help protect others from similar victimization. We developed new client screening procedures that incorporated psychological evaluation and background investigation techniques that could identify potential predators before they gained access to vulnerable individuals. The security consulting division we established became particularly successful in helping other wealthy individuals and families protect themselves from the kind of sophisticated fraud schemes that Derek had mastered. Our approach combined financial analysis with behavioral assessment and strategic planning that could identify and neutralize threats before they resulted in significant losses or personal harm. Perhaps most importantly, the Derek Morrison case had taught me that true security couldn't be purchased through traditional means like bodyguards or alarm systems. The most dangerous threats came from people who gained access through trust and affection, making them invisible to conventional protective measures until they chose to reveal their true intentions. The educational initiatives that grew out of this understanding became some of Meridian's most meaningful contributions to protecting potential victims from financial predators. We partnered with law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations to develop training programs that could help people recognize and respond to sophisticated manipulation tactics before they resulted in financial or physical harm. The yearly conference we began hosting brought together law enforcement officials, mental health professionals, financial experts, and survivors of financial crimes to share knowledge and develop better strategies for preventing and responding to predatory behavior. Derek's case served as a central example of how sophisticated criminals operated and how potential victims could protect themselves through awareness and preparation. Derek himself never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes or acknowledgement of the harm he had caused to his victims. His letters from prison, which were provided to law enforcement as part of ongoing monitoring of his activities, revealed continued resentment about his conviction and fantasies about eventual revenge against those who had testified against him. The psychological evaluation conducted during his 5th year of incarceration confirmed that Derek remained a significant danger to public safety and showed no evidence of rehabilitation or genuine understanding of the moral implications of his criminal behavior. His continued lack of empathy for his victims made it clear that his long prison sentence was necessary not just as punishment for past crimes, but as protection for potential future victims. The most satisfying aspect of Derek's imprisonment was the knowledge that his own character flaws and criminal choices had made his destruction inevitable. If he had possessed the moral integrity to build legitimate success through honest work and genuine relationships, he could have shared in the kind of wealth and prosperity that his criminal schemes had attempted to steal. Instead, Derek's decision to view other people as sources of money to be exploited had led him to target someone with superior resources and capabilities, ensuring that his criminal career would end in complete defeat and decades of incarceration. The predator had become prey because he had chosen to hunt in waters where larger predators swam. The Derek Morrison case became a permanent part of my identity and professional mission, but it no longer defined the boundaries of my emotional life or my capacity for trust and relationships. The healing process had been long and sometimes difficult, but it had ultimately strengthened my understanding of genuine human connection and my appreciation for the people in my life who demonstrated consistent integrity and authentic care for my well-being. The experience had taught me that trust must be earned through consistent actions over time, rather than accepted based on romantic presentations or surface charm. More importantly, it had demonstrated that my professional skills and resources could be used not just to build wealth, but to create justice and protect innocent people from those who would exploit their trust and vulnerability. Derek Morrison thought he could murder his wife for insurance money and live comfortably on the proceeds of his crime. Instead, he learned that targeting Victoria Chen Morrison was the most expensive mistake of his life, one that would cost him everything he valued, while ensuring that his victims received justice and protection from future harm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.